I think we often err by making the assumption that the world consists of two types of states, democracies versus non-democracies. The reality is the world is much more complicated than that. Both types, non-democracy and democracy, have internal differences within the categories about how power is maintained or what the purpose of the state should be or assumptions about what good or common good is. As a result, when you get into an examination of democracy, you find there are lots of different moving parts, lots of different kinds. And the same thing is going to be true with non-democracies. So to explain why, I want to take a look at three different questions, three different ways of asking if democracy is in fact the best form of government. The first of these that I want to consider is to think about democracy in a philosophical kind of way. To ask a series of questions of democracy and to understand if maybe some of these questions might lead us to wonder if democracy is really the way we want to go. The second thing I want to look at is I want to think about what types of government might be in the best interest of a ruler. And then finally, I want to consider this question or this problem of irreconcilable differences, of issues that can't easily be divided or can't easily be solved. So first of all, why not democracy? What you see on the screen are a series of philosophical questions, things that our founding fathers considered in the United States, things that authors of constitutions or creators of governments have to consider all around the world. Some of these questions are basically about the appropriate place for the individual. So consider, is it in fact true that the individual is the fundamental unit of society? A fundamental assumption of liberal democracy or liberal concepts. If it's not the fundamental unit, is it the best unit? Or maybe should we be thinking about things like family or church or businesses as the most important unit? Another question to consider are the average, not necessarily the people at the bottom of the society or the bottom of the state, but are the average fit to rule? Or in fact would be better off having people who are more well educated or who are trained in governance to be the ones who rule. Think about, does the community or the state actually have the power to protect itself? Or does it necessarily have to resign itself to looking for help from others, either outside of the state or from others outside of a community? Fifth, if I think about the question of law, do I assume that the laws of man, the laws that are created by individuals, by us as humans, are those the highest form of law? Or in fact, is there a form of law or a type of law that is above the laws of humans, above the laws of man, maybe a law of the divine or a law of God? And then finally, think about questions that are not easily solved. What we learned in the political violence chapter, what we learned as intractable conflicts over homelands or origin lands or over resources or conflicts over ideology where one side can have them and the other side can't. Now, if you answer any of these questions by saying no, in fact, individuals aren't the best unit or the laws of man aren't the highest form of law, then you have reason to question the wisdom of democracy. Because for any of these, it's not possible for humans or the average human to reach a peaceful solution. But if you question all of them, if your answer to all of these questions is no, then in fact you kind of got grounds to deny that democracy is really the best way to think about politics. Okay, so here's a second way to look at it. This way is to think about the question of regime or government survival. Now, if I think about the government, the people who are actually in power, there is a political scientist named Bueno de Mesquita who says that really government is picked or it's selected by a narrow group of people in the population. Now, in democracies, that selection is going to be very, very large. In the United States, it's 50 to 60% of the adult population. In other countries, though, the power structure might be such that that selectorate might be relatively small. Now, if you're in the government, one of the questions that you're going to concern yourself with is, what is the right selectorate that keeps me in power? The government wants to stay in power, after all. They can't govern otherwise. What you may find is that it's best for the government in certain circumstances to shrink or narrow the size of that selectorate. And the smaller it gets, the less democratic the country is. The third way that I want us to think about this question of democracy is to look at this idea of the regime and to think about how would I compare regimes in terms of the level of tolerance. Now, a political scientist named Flanagan came up with this idea of the V of totalitarianism, or the V of tolerance. And he said that if you think about the state, if you think about government as having an ideological range from the left to the right, or from the liberal to the conservative, what you're necessarily going to discover is that for any society, there are going to be some questions which aren't going to be tolerated. Maybe it's extreme right questions about slavery being acceptable, or maybe it's to the extreme left, like private property shouldn't exist. But in any regime or any state, as you move to the edges, we're going to be less and less willing to have certain types of conversations. So what happens if I have a society that is by its nature far to the left or far to the right? Or if by its nature it is relatively intolerant, that most people share virtually identical views? Well, if you notice in this kind of example of a narrowly constructed right-wing society, or a narrowly constructed right-wing state, there is an entire range of issues to the left which society simply won't be able to tolerate, which if they grow too numerous or too many people begin to accept them, society as a whole is going to react to them, and the reaction is going to be some level of authoritarianism or some level of totalitarianism.